Biology 1108, Presentation Number 8, Plants. Depending on the book we are happening to be using this semester, the title of the chapter might read something like Evolution of Plants or Evolutionary History of Plants. And if it does, well, a better title that will truly better describe the content of this presentation is General Plant Diversity Kingdom Plantae. We will touch on the evolution of plants, but we will primarily be focused on plant characteristics, and we will identify 4 major plant divisions, focusing specifically on the more primitive or more simple groups called the seedless vascular plants, which would be the mosses and the ferns. So that kind of gives you a bird's eye view of where we are headed. This particular presentation is on general plant diversity. We'll be talking about 2 of the 4 major divisions we find in the Kingdom Plantae, but not before we talk about general characteristics of the kingdom. Well, okay, in terms of biological diversity, so far we have looked at the bacteria. Specifically, we've looked at the bacteria that are found in the domain bacteria, which would be the true bacteria, the bacteria that you and I generally encounter on a daily basis. We talked about the archaebacteria, classified in the domain Archaea. Although prokaryotic groups are significantly different in a number of respects. We mentioned the viruses. While they're not living, we inserted them into the presentation on the bacteria, and we talked about the protists. Now we're about to talk about the Kingdom Plantae. The Kingdom Plantae, in terms of characteristics, are a member of the domain Eukarya, and they are eukaryotic, therefore. They are multicellular. They are sessile, which means they don't move, and they are photosynthetic, which means they are capable of making their own food molecules using the sun's energy. So we could say they are autotrophic, we could say they are photoautotrophic, or we could say they're photosynthetic. They utilize a unique set of photosynthetic pigments to do that job. They have chlorophyll A, they have chlorophyll B, they have carotenoids, and they store their photosynthate, or the products of photosynthesis, as starch. And just to mention that when we contrast the Kingdom Plantae with the photosynthetic members of the Kingdom Protista, and you remember we called those algae, of those algae, there is one group that is considered to be ancestral to the Kingdom Plantae, and that group would be the division Chlorophyta, or the green algae, primarily on the basis that the green algae, or the Chlorophyta, has the same basic photosynthetic pigments as the Kingdom Plantae. And there's quite a bit of evidence to support that relationship between the two. The division Chlorophyta is considered to be ancestral to the Kingdom Plantae. Another characteristic of the Kingdom Plantae, which is consistent throughout the kingdom, is they have a unique type of sexual life cycle called a sporic meiosis life cycle. A lot of what we're going to be talking about on this particular presentation and in the next presentation will have to do with this life cycle, so we need to get a handle on it. The sporic meiosis life cycle, you might jot this down, is sometimes also called an alternation of generations type of life cycle. The name implies something about the process. In the sporic meiosis life cycle, there will be the production of spores, and those spores will be made by meiosis. So if you can remember that, that's one huge step to understanding the actual life cycle. You could also Google sporic meiosis life cycle or alternation of generations or plant life cycle and come up with 1,001 versions of the same illustration that we see here on this slide. And what I did is I chose to include a diagram that's fairly simplistic, although some of the diagrams you find online can be extremely complicated. Just want to let you know. So we're talking about an alternation in generations life cycle. Obviously, there's two generations involved. What are these generations? Well, one is a haploid generation, and the second is called a diploid generation. And if you look at the life cycle, you will see that as you follow the cycle clockwise, you alternate between what is haploid and what is diploid. And what is haploid is illustrated at the bottom of the illustration, and what is diploid is illustrated at the top. We will start with a focus on the haploid generation of the life cycle. Part of the life cycle is spent as a haploid individual. The haploid individual is officially known as the gametophyte. Now, literally, that means gamete-producing plant. So here's another term that is somewhat descriptive. And this particular part of the life cycle's job is to make sex cells. So the gametophyte is haploid. The gametophyte makes gametes or sex cells, which are haploid, and it will do so through a process of mitosis. Now, don't get confused, because in animals, gametes are made by meiosis, and that's because animals are diploid. In this case, the gametophyte is haploid. The only way you could possibly make a gamete is through the process of mitosis. Something that's haploid must make something that's haploid through mitosis. So the gametes which are going to be produced by this gametophyte will ultimately undergo fertilization. You will see the word syngamy down there. You remember that the word syngamy is an official term for fertilization, and at which point you'll make a zygote. The zygote is diploid. Then the zygote will ultimately grow into the sporophyte. So looking at our life cycle diagram up here, I see that little 2n on the left-hand side of the figure. That would be our zygote. And our zygote would grow into the full-blown diploid version of this life cycle, which is called the sporophyte. More about that on our next slide. Now, one more thing. In general, in the kingdom Plantae, the gametophyte is a relatively insignificant, inconspicuous part of the life cycle, even though it fulfills a haploid stage in an alternation of generations. It's difficult to find. So, for example, in seed plants, things like pine trees and oak trees and grass plants and garden plants and most of the plants you and I are familiar with, the gametophyte is teeny tiny little things you and I can't see usually. Gametophytes are pollen grains. Gametophytes are ovules, which ultimately make seeds. So in a plant life cycle, the lesser significant generation, not less important, but the lesser significant generation, less conspicuous, less obvious, is the gametophyte. So let's shift our attention now to the sporophyte generation, which happens to be the conspicuous, the persistent, the obvious stage in a plant life cycle. Well, there you have it. We've shifted our focus from the lower half of this life cycle diagram to the upper half. We are focusing on the part of the life cycle called the sporophyte. Now, that name, sporophyte, literally means spore-producing plant. So here I've got a diploid stage in the life cycle. Its job is to make spores. And now spores are haploid as well. But if you're a diploid organism and you need to make some kind of haploid product, in this case a spore, the only way you can do that is through a process of meiosis. And so once those spores are produced, they will give rise to the gametophyte generation. So what we're doing is we're closing the loop on this particular life cycle. The lower half of the cycle, the gametophyte, produces gametes, which undergo syngamy, produces little 2n zygote I see on the left. The 2n zygote grows into the sporophyte, the diploid organism, at which point the sporophyte produces spores by meiosis, which are haploid. I see the little n over on the right-hand side of the diagram, and I'm right back to the gametophyte generation. So if I follow the life cycle in a clockwise fashion, we are alternating between what is haploid and what is diploid. And the important thing to remember is I've got two contrasting events that are the pivot points between what is haploid and what is diploid. On the left, the pivot point, the transition between what is haploid and diploid, is fertilization or syngamy. And what is the pivot point or the transition between what is diploid and what is haploid on the right is going to be meiosis. And you might remember from some lecture long ago and far away, you cannot have a sexual life cycle unless you have syngamy and meiosis. Those are two unavoidable characteristics of a sexual life cycle. Now, once again, to focus on what is significant here. The haploid organism, you'll remember the gametophyte is less significant in a typical plant life cycle. Not less important, but less significant. And the sporophyte generation happens to be the significant, the conspicuous, the persistent portion of the life cycle. If I go out into nature and I look for a plant, what I will see is a sporophyte. It's a tree, it's a sporophyte. It's a shrub, it's a sporophyte. It's a herb growing in a garden, it is a sporophyte. Generally, the sporophyte in the kingdom Plantae life cycle is the individual that you see. It is the individual that you equate with being a plant. Here's where we're headed. In the kingdom Plantae, there are what we will consider to be 4 major divisions. I'm going to caution you, I'm going to tell you there are more divisions than this. Some of the divisions within the kingdom Plantae are actually extinct. They're only known as fossilized organisms. We're going to be taking a look at 4 extant, that's E-X-T-A-N-T, meaning currently living divisions of plants. The division Bryophyta, which are the mosses, the division Pterophyta, which are the ferns, and then the last 2 divisions qualify as seed plants. They're a lot more advanced than the first 2. And we will actually be just touching on the division Coniferophyta, which are the conifers or the cone-bearing plants, which would include the pines, and then the division Anthophyta, which are the flowering plants. And we'll probably focus a tremendous amount of them on our next presentation. So once again, we're looking at plant diversity from the standpoint of focusing on 4 extant divisions. In this presentation, we will be focusing on the first 2. These are not the only divisions of plants. It's not an exhaustive list. There are plenty of other divisions, but for the sake of simplicity and for the sake of truly understanding the kingdom Plantae, our best bet is to focus on these limited number of divisions. Let's take a look at our first division, Division Bryophyta, which includes mosses, but also a lesser known plant called the liverworts. Mosses are photographed upper right, liverworts lower right. These organisms are characterized as being non-vascular plants. Now, a non-vascular plant is a plant that lacks vascular tissue. In a nutshell, vascular tissue is tissue that transports substances through the plant. Think about a tree. A tree needs to transport water from the roots up to the leaves. And then a tree needs to transport food, sugars, from the leaves down to the rest of the plant. The tree is large enough that it can't rely strictly on diffusion, so it's got a specialized tissue to do so. So right now, let's take a quick look at what xylem and phloem are. Xylem is a tissue that is responsible for conducting water and minerals. Xylem conducts these materials in an exclusively upwards direction. Phloem, on the other hand, its job is to conduct sugars, which are the products of photosynthesis. And phloem conducts those sugars dissolved in water, so it's conducting a sugar solution, commonly known as sap, And sometimes that direction of movement is upwards. In other words, if I'm storing sugars as starch in the roots, I might want to transport those sugar molecules upwards to help those cells in the leaves and in the twigs to maybe stay alive when the sun's not out and they're not doing photosynthesis, or perhaps even during the winter when the plant's not able to do photosynthesis. But on the other hand, phloem can conduct those same sugars downwards, particularly on a nice sunny day or during the summer or during the spring. You're manufacturing sugars through photosynthesis, and some of those sugars are going to be transported downwards to keep the rest of the plant alive, or maybe even to store those sugars as starch. But the bryophytes don't have that. Bryophytes are considered to be the most primitive group of plants. So bryophytes are a primitive group of plants, Dr. Knaus. Why do you say that? Well, you think about it, plants are thought to have evolved out of the division Chlorophyta, which were the green algae, aquatic organisms. If you're an aquatic organism, there is no need to have any kind of vascular tissue because you're already living in the water. So any nutrients that you make, any nutrients that you need, any photosynthesis that you're doing is found all throughout the plant or all around the plant. There is no need to have vascular tissue. So therefore, being the primitive group of the land plants, the kingdom Plantae, the bryophytes wouldn't necessarily have vascular tissue. Now, I want you to notice something else on this particular list. No xylem, no phloem, and then you'll see the word cuticle. So I need to define that very, very quickly. A cuticle is a layer of wax that coats the plant. The purpose of a cuticle is to seal the plant's tissues against desiccation or evaporation. See, one of the consequences of living in a terrestrial environment is it's a desiccating environment, which means if you've got water inside of you, there's a very good chance it's going to evaporate away. And if it evaporates away, you will desiccate and you will die. A cuticle is an adaptation to correct for that particular problem. So bryophytes don't have xylem, don't have phloem, they don't have a cuticle. They don't have these characteristics that would render them highly adapted to a terrestrial existence. It's one of the reasons why bryophytes are found in moist habitats. They can't handle these desiccating environments where a lot of plants might not do so badly. It's one of the reasons why bryophytes are so small. They can't get really, really big because they have no vascular tissue to provide the transport that's necessary to maintain such a large size. So bryophytes, mosses, liverworts, non-vascular plants. They don't have xylem, they don't have phloem, they don't have a cuticle. Those characteristics are going to prove to be very important as this presentation and the next presentation go by. So, Dr. Knaus, you're spending way too much time on this slide. What's next? Well, bryophytes are seedless plants. Now, if you're a seedless plant, obviously it means you don't make seeds. A little bit later, we will figure out that a seed is an adaptation to life on land. Bryophytes don't make seeds. They reproduce by making spores. And water is required for a fertilization event. Bryophytes, yes, they do make eggs, they do make sperm. In order to get the sperm to the egg to effect a fertilization, you need water as a medium for getting that sperm to the egg. Now, obviously, that's another primitive characteristic, because basically, if you were living life in an aquatic environment like a green algae, water is there and it is your agent for getting that sperm cell to that egg cell. Now, all of a sudden, we've got these mosses and they're living on land, and somehow they got to effect fertilization events. And the only way they can do it is by releasing their sperm and allowing that sperm to swim through a very fine film of water that exists on the plant. It's how you get the sperm from the sperm container to the egg. And so it's one of the reasons why bryophytes or mosses or these liverworts, you see them live in such damp habitats. That way you do have this layer of water, and that way you have a means to get that sperm to the egg. Okay, so our bryophytes are mosses and liverworts. Mosses you're familiar with, liverworts you might be less familiar with. But the last bullet point on this particular slide is really important. It is an exception to the rest of the kingdom Plantae. When you look at a moss plant, when you look at a liverwort, you are looking at a haploid individual. Now you remember, for most plants, the sporophyte is the dominant and conspicuous generation. In the bryophytes, it's the gametophyte. So the gametophyte is the moss plant that you see on the upper right here. The gametophyte is the liverwort plant that you see on below right. But for the majority of plants, it's the sporophyte that is the dominant and persistent generation. So make sure you know the bryophytes are non-vascular, seedless plants. They don't have xylem, they don't have phloem, they don't have a cuticle, they don't make seeds, they do make spores, and water is a requirement for fertilization. And then finally, the gametophyte is the dominant generation in the life cycle. Our next task with respect to the bryophytes is to learn the moss life cycle. Now, I'm going to caution you that there's plenty of visual versions of the moss life cycle found online. This one on this particular slide is only one of many, and I would strongly encourage you to click through a Google search for moss life cycle images and find one that's agreeable to you. See, for many of us, our being able to get value from some diagram is a very, very personal thing. It's how your brain is able to interpret someone else's illustration of something. And sometimes it's agreeable and sometimes it's not. So I'm looking at this diagram right now thinking, oh, this diagram makes perfect sense. I can cope with this. Some of you guys might look at this diagram and think, this guy's full of crap. I mean, I don't understand this diagram. This diagram is making my eyes roll back in my head. So find one that works. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run through these different bullet points on the left-hand side of the slide. Every single one of those terms are going to be important in terms of any exam you're going to take. Every single one of those terms are going to be found in this life cycle diagram, and they will have an important role and place in the life cycle of the moss. The first thing I need you to notice from this life cycle is there's a top half and there's a bottom half. The top half, which is illustrated with kind of bluish lines, is the gametophyte generation. And the bottom half, which is illustrated by the mauve line or peach colored line or pink colored line, however it's showing up on your illustration, is the sporophyte. So I've got an alternation of generations life cycle, and it's going to run clockwise. You will notice that the pivot point, the transition point on the right, is labeled fertilization, and the transition point on the left is labeled meiosis. So we've got all of the hallmark features of a sporic meiosis or alternation of generations life cycle. We're going to start over on the far left, which would be like 9 o'clock. I see spores. And spores are these teeny tiny little haploid structures that are released by the moss plant. You might want to put a 1N next to spores there. Now, when those spores are released, they will grow into a teeny tiny little filamentous juvenile called a protonema. Interestingly enough, the protonema looks an awful lot like the green algal ancestor we might consider to be ancestral to the land plants. But what the protonema does is it grows into a big multicellular gametophyte. You'll see that leafy green plant that is the typical moss plant that you and I see out in nature. But the thing is those moss plants that we see out in nature, some are male and some are female. That's why the line splits into two. That's why the upper moss plant is labeled male gametophyte, and it's why the lower moss plant is labeled female gametophyte. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the male first, and then we'll take a look at the female. And then we'll see how the gametes they make get us back to producing spores ultimately. So let's take a look at the male moss plant up top. The male moss plant produces gamete containers. Now remember, a gamete is a sex cell. And the gamete containers are located at the very top of the male moss plant, and they're called antheridia, or antheridium singular. And each antheridium contains a whole bunch of sperm cells, and the sperm cells are haploid. So I've got a haploid gametophyte producing haploid sperm. Mitosis is how that would happen. But the bottom line is that sperm is going to need to be released, and that sperm will need to find its way to a female. Let's take a look at the female. The female, illustrated immediately below the male, forms her own gamete containers. They are called archegonia, or archegonium singular. They look like little vases. It's a long-necked tube, and sitting at the very bottom of that long-necked tube is an egg cell. Now that egg cell is not going anywhere. It stays there. And so the sperm released from the antheridia are going to swim, like I said on the previous slide, through a very thin film of water. You could call it dew or whatever you want to call it. These plants live in very moist habitats. That sperm, which is a flagellated cell, is going to be able to swim, and it will swim its way from the antheridium down through the archegonium into where the egg cell is. So, lo and behold, on the far right-hand side of our diagram, I see fertilization. Fertilization, meaning fertilization of the egg, leads to the formation of the zygote, which is the very first diploid cell arising from an event of fertilization or syngamy. And a zygote is going to divide, and it's going to grow into a baby plant. Now, the name for a baby plant is an embryo. And I know this is a word that we use in animals and in humans in particular. It doesn't mean anything different. An embryo is a baby plant. Now, keep in mind that this embryo is going to be developing inside of the archegonium that's still on the female. And so all the illustrations I see across the bottom of there show me that my zygote grows into an embryo that goes into a very young sporophyte, all on top of the female gametophyte. And that sporophyte grows into a long, wiry structure that has a little container at the top. And that little container at the top is a spore container. It's called a sporangium. A sporangium is a spore container. Sometimes it's called a capsule. It's got a little lid, and the little lid pops off, and it releases the spores. Now, you and I both already know that those spores are haploid. We know that the sporophyte is diploid, and that means that the process of getting those spores produced in that spore container is meiosis, and that's why we got meiosis labeled over there on the left-hand side of the diagram. Once those spores are released, we're right back to where we were before. The spores grow into the gametophytes. Gametophytes make sperm. If you're a male, make eggs. If you're a female, you get fertilization. You get the sporophyte. You make spores. You go through the cycle over and over and over again. And as I look at the cycle, I realize that the moss plants that I see in nature are those same gametophytes that I see at the top part of the illustration, the males and the females, and that the lesser obvious part of the life cycle is the sporophyte portion of the life cycle. Make sure you know all of these terms and make sure how they fit into the generalized moss life cycle. And it might be a big help to make sure that you know that the moss life cycle, as complicated as it looks here, is no different from the very simplistic diagram of an alternation of life cycles that we looked at not too long ago. Let's talk about ferns. Ferns are placed in the division Pterophyta. Now, a big difference between the bryophytes and the ferns is that the ferns have vascular tissue. We're going to understand that ferns are at least one step further to being better adapted to a terrestrial existence. They're not perfect, but they're a lot better than the bryophytes. The bryophytes didn't have xylem. The bryophytes didn't have phloem. The bryophytes didn't have a cuticle. Well, the ferns do. If you're a plant and you have vascular tissue, and cuticle always comes along with vascular tissue. If you are a plant and you've got vascular tissue and a cuticle, you are called a tracheophyte. Now, that prefix tracheo means tubes. That implies vascular tissue. So vascular plants are tracheophytes. Tracheophytes are better adapted to life on land simply because they got the xylem, they got the phloem, they got the cuticle. Now, despite that fact, the ferns still have 1 foot in the water, so to speak. And the reason why the ferns have 1 foot in the water is they are still seedless plants. So they reproduce by making spores, and water is still a requirement for fertilization. If you really want to break with an aquatic environment, somehow you got to come up with some alternative to the water requirement. And we're going to see that not too long from now. But for the moment, we're going to understand that ferns are a little bit better adapted to life on land. They are all placed in this division called the Pterophyta. And then finally, when you look at a fern in the woods or in the garden or growing on a tree, that fern is a sporophyte. That is the dominant, conspicuous, persistent generation. We're going to see in the life cycle in a moment that the other part of the life cycle, the gametophyte, is very small and very insignificant. So unlike the bryophytes, in which the gametophyte was the dominant generation, in the ferns, the sporophyte is the dominant generation, and that's going to be the same situation in our seed plants. We'll see in a moment. Let's take a look at the life cycle of a typical fern. Now, this illustration is a little bit different, but once again, you'll want to Google fern life cycle and find whatever images do best to being agreeable with how your brain operates. This one I like. In other words, I see a diagram here, which is somewhat similar. I see the left-hand side of the diagram corresponds to the sporophyte generation. The right-hand side of the diagram corresponds to gametophyte generation. Now, on first glance, you'll notice that the sporophyte generation on the left is the fern that you and I are familiar with. That's the sporophyte generation. It is the dominant generation. It is the conspicuous generation. It is the persistent generation. On the right, you see the gametophyte, which I mentioned was not dominant, not conspicuous, not persistent. As a matter of fact, that little itty-bitty heart-shaped individual that you see there on the right is the gametophyte in the fern life cycle, and it's no more than 1 or 2 millimeters across. It's very, very small. Compare that to the really, really large plant you see there on the left, and you see this huge disparity. Now, remember, in the bryophytes, it was the exact opposite. The gametophyte was the dominant generation. In this case, it's the sporophyte, and that's going to be true for the seed plants as we go through them. So then the other thing that I see is at the bottom of the life cycle, as I transition from haploid to diploid, as I go from right to left, I see the word fertilization. And at the top of the cycle, as I go from what is diploid to what is haploid, as I go from the left to the right, I see meiosis. So these are my pivot points. These are my transitions. And so the life cycle is going to work exactly the same way as the moss life cycle worked, and it's going to work exactly the same way as a typical alternation of generations. but the devil's in the details. So let's take a look at those details. We're going to start off at 12 o'clock on the illustration. Ferns make spores. And they will make spores in teeny tiny little brown dots that are found underneath of the fronds. And so at the very top left, you see a close-up view of one of those teeny tiny little brown dots, and an even closer inset showing me that meiosis occurs in these little brown dots and produces these spores. So I'm going to start off with spores. Spores, you remember, are haploid. So I would write down 1N next to the spores there. And the spores are going to grow into the gametophyte, which is that teeny, tiny, little heart-shaped individual. And that individual is non-vascular. So it resembles a primitive plant in all respects. And its job is to produce sex cells or gametes. That's what gametophyte does, produces gametes. And it will produce gametes in either Antheridia, which are sperm containers, or Archegonia, which are egg containers. Turns out that both sexes are commonly found on the same gametophyte individual. Regardless, you will see an Antheridium down there, and you will see an Archegonium. The Archegonium looks like it's sitting inside of the middle of a volcano. It's nothing more than a short version of the Archegonium that we saw in the moss plants. And so the egg cell's sitting there, and it's waiting to be fertilized. So fertilization event takes place, that egg becomes a zygote, and then you'll see the inset showing you after fertilization, this zygote grows a little bit bigger and becomes an embryo, a baby plant. And that embryo eventually will grow into the full-blown fern sporophyte that you see on the left. The fern makes its fronds, and you find those reproductive structures on the bottom of the fronds. Meiosis takes place, and you make spores, and so you're right back to where you started off with. So yeah, once again, the life cycle is essentially nothing more than an alternation of generations life cycle that we've seen before. It's only slightly different from the moss life cycle because I see a lot of the same terminology here. So make sure, once again, you know the terminology and you know where the terminology fits in the overall fern life cycle. The sporophyte makes spores by meiosis. The spores grow into a gametophyte, which is a tiny, non-vascular individual that's got both Antheridia and Archegonia. The Antheridia contains sperm. The Archegonia contain eggs. Now, those sperm are going to be released, and they're going to swim through a layer of water to get to the Archegonium, because you remember, water is still a requirement for fertilization. And so the sperm are going to get to the Archegonium, fertilize the egg, which grows into a embryo, which then grows into a big leafy sporophyte. And we're right back to where we started off with. The two divisions we just talked about, the division Bryophyta and the division Pterophyta, are seedless plants. We are now about to talk about the seed plants. Now, the seed plants represent a more complete adaptation to terrestrial existence, and that's the purpose of this slide and probably the next slide after. Seed plants are all tracheophytes, and so tracheophytes, you'll remember, have xylem, they have phloem, they have a cuticle. So they are able to transport water, they're able to transport food, they're able to resist desiccation. In terms of the life cycle, the gametophytes in a seed plant life cycle are highly reduced. They're so highly reduced to basically remove them from the potential problems associated with a terrestrial existence. Because you'll remember that one of the main things a gametophyte does is, at least if it's a male, it produces sperm cells. And sperm cells need water to swim from the male to the female. Well, if you're a terrestrial plant, you don't have that water. You don't have that availability. So your best bet to try to get that sperm cell to survive is to take the gametophyte that makes it and to reduce it and protect it. And the same thing would be true for the egg. You want the egg protected. So in our seed plants, we're going to have some special terminology to identify the highly reduced female gametophyte and the highly reduced male gametophyte. The female gametophyte is called the ovule. The ovule is a very, very tiny structure that after fertilization will become a seed. So the ovule sounds like ovary. As a matter of fact, that's where the name comes from, is a tiny female gametophyte. It is retained, and you might add the word protected on the sporophyte. The male gametophyte in these seed plants is called pollen. Most of you guys are familiar with pollen. It blows off of pine trees in the summer, and it is carried by bees to fertilize flowers. Well, pollen are tiny little males, and being that tiny, they are protected. They are going to be delivered to the female. See, here's the beauty of the system here. Instead of needing water to get a sperm cell from the male to the female, what we're going to do is going to practice direct delivery. The pollen grain, which is a single male, will get delivered directly to the doorstep of the female. No fuss, no bother, no water required. So when the wind blows and it blows all that pine pollen around, that pine pollen is ultimately trying to get to a female so you can effect a fertilization event. When a bumblebee flies from flower to flower to flower, it's carrying a load of pollen from one plant to the next to try to effect a fertilization event. And because this is a terrestrial situation, we don't need to rely on water. So the great thing is a reduced female gametophyte, an ovule, a reduced male gametophyte, a pollen grain. Both of those are ideally suited as an adaptation to a terrestrial existence because we don't have to rely on water as a medium for getting the sperm to the egg anymore. So sex in seed plants is a matter of two events. The first event is getting the male to the female. That's called pollination. Then the second event is what happens between the male and the female, and that's fertilization. But once again, the point is, if I can perform pollination, I can perform direct delivery of the male to the female, no water required. So once the female gametophyte, the ovule, is fertilized, it becomes a seed. And a seed is also an adaptation to terrestrial existence. Anytime you guys have opened a package of seeds, you see these teeny tiny little hard things. And you know that a seed has the ability to stay dormant over months and months and months. As a matter of fact, I've been in the bad habit of planting seed packages that I bought 2 years ago. And I will still get some of those seeds to germinate. So how do they do that? Well, the seed is designed to be able to withstand bad, adverse conditions. And so if a seed is set in springtime of this year, it will manage to go through summer, through fall, through winter, and be able to germinate in spring of the following year. Seed has a seed coat. That's a hard outer covering that protects the seed from the environment around it. The seed contains a teeny tiny little baby plant that we're going to call the embryo. You will see it's an immature sporophyte. That means baby plant. And around that embryo will be a material called a food source. So the embryo is encapsulated, has its own food source, and is able to hang out, so to speak, from the point at which it's generated in 1 year, and then when it germinates or resumes growth in the following year. Once again, a really, really good adaptation to terrestrial existence. So in the plant kingdom, we're seeing a trend. We're seeing a trend in transition from life in the water to life on land. And in bryophytes, we're pretty much still got 1 full foot in the water. In ferns, we get xylem, phloem, and a cuticle. But we're still require water for fertilization. In seed plants, we got the full thing. We've got the xylem, we got the phloem, we got the cuticle. We also reduce the size of gametophytes so they can be protected, so I can actually perform a pollination event, direct delivery to the female, Then I get fertilization, no water required, and then once fertilization takes place, the ovule becomes this highly resistant structure called a seed. These are all awesome adaptations to life on land. So at this point, we've been through 2 of the 4 plant divisions we're ultimately going to be looking at. And these first 2 divisions kind of highlight the adaptations that were necessary to bridge a transition from life in water as an ancestral plant, as a green algae, to land plants. So what I'm going to do on these next 2 slides will basically just set the stage for our next presentation, which is on seed plants. Seed plants are the members of the plant kingdom that you and I are most familiar with. The cone-bearing plants, commonly called the gymnosperms, and the flowering plants, commonly called the angiosperms. So let's just take a brief glance at them, then move into our next presentation. Seed plants include 2 groups, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. They differ in terms of how their seeds exist. They differ in terms of how they actually reproduce. They differ in terms of how primitive versus how advanced they are. So let's take a look at the gymnosperms. The gymnosperms are plants that have naked seeds. That's literally what the word gymnosperm means. Naked seeds. Now, in this case, the seeds that are produced, and you remember a seed is a fertilized ovule. Those ovules are, for the most part, unprotected. You take a look at a pine tree. Most of you realize that pine trees make pine cones. Well, if you look at a pine cone, you realize a pine cone is nothing more than a bunch of woody scales. And those woody scales have little bitty seeds on them. And when the pine cone opens, the seeds are right out there. It's just like laying something on a shelf. The individual scales of the pine cone are like little shells, and those ovules just sit there unprotected. Eventually, they're going to be shed, but those ovules, being seeds, are formed through a process of pollination. That's when all of that pine pollen starts blowing through the air, and it gets all over your car, and it gets all over the windows, it gets over everything. Some of those pine pollen grains will make it to a female, and after the pollination, you get the fertilization event, and after the fertilization, you get the formation of a seed. So that's what happens in the conifers. So that's what happens in gymnosperms. Now, gymnosperms are a lot of different plants. We are going to learn that the division Coniferaphida are the classic version of what a gymnosperm is. The Coniferaphida are commonly called the conifers. These are the cone-bearing plants. Pine trees, spruce trees, fir trees, hemlock trees, what you and I commonly think of as evergreens in many cases are members of the Coniferaphida. They have naked seeds. Those naked seeds are formed on cones. The cone is where the pollination takes place. The cone is where the fertilization takes place, and it's where the seeds are formed. Now, I should mention that the gymnosperms, for the simple fact that they do have these unprotected ovules, are considered to be more primitive than the angiosperms, which is the next group we're about to look at. So don't discount the fact that your gymnosperms still have xylem, still have phloem, still have a cuticle. Okay, they still have reduced gymnosperms. They still make seeds. Yes, they are perfectly adapted to life on land. But we're going to see there's an actual added adaptation we can get when we talk about the angiosperms. All right, that big adaptation arises in the angiosperms, and it's where we take those ovules and we protect them. So you'll see our first bullet point tells me that the angiosperms are plants with covered seeds. Angio meaning container, sperm meaning seeds, hence covered seeds. So those seeds are actually contained in a reproductive structure called a flower. The angiosperms are commonly called the flowering plants because they make these reproductive structures called flowers. Flowers are comparative to the cones that we saw in the previous group. But inside a flower, we've got this structure called an ovary. And the ovary is this container that contains these ovules. So when pollination takes place, and so I'm looking at these lilies on the illustration here, a bumblebee might come along and pick up pollen from the stamens and carry that pollen to the next flower, at which point the pollen is deposited, the pollen grains would germinate, and they would form little teeny tiny pollen tubes that would grow all the way down to the base of the flower, where we would find this ovary and these ovules. And at that point, fertilization takes place, and at that point, those ovules become seeds. And at some point, the petals of the flower fall off, and you're left with a seed pod. The seed pod is a container containing seeds. Seed pod is what we would call a fruit. A fruit is a fertilized ovary. We will make this point later on in our next presentation. So seed plants come in two different flavors, angiosperms and gymnosperms. Gymnosperms are considered to be the more primitive group. Their seeds are naked. Angiosperms are considered to be more advanced. Their seeds are covered, contained in a ovary that eventually becomes a fruit. So from your experience, you know that tomatoes contain seeds, apples contain seeds, watermelon contains seeds, cucumbers contain seeds. Those are all fruits. Those structures are all derived from the flower, and their purpose is to protect those seeds that are contained within. Now, one other point to kind of stay consistent with our last slide, and that is the angiosperms, or the flowering plants, are generally classified in a single division called the division Anthophyta. The Anthophyta are the group that consists of these flowering plants. And our example is the lily, and we'll take a closer look at that in our next presentation, along with the pine, when we start looking at seed plants in detail.